Welcome back to Sunday Roast. I'm your host, JJ from Top Dog Seeds. When we last left off, it was 1985, and I had just gotten busted. For most people, that would be the end of their story. But for me, it was just the beginning. Because leading up into that time, I had just been getting weed from local dealers around town. And around the same time, a high school friend was walking through Washington Square Park and met someone, and he was brought over to a weed spot on Houston Street off the corner of Mott Street. And it was a storefront that was right off the corner, maybe two or three stores off the corner of Mott Street. And so me and a friend both went and got hooked up with that spot. And it was my first real hookup in New York City because leading up into then, no, we would just go and hang out in Washington Square Park or go up to 42nd Street. We'd take the bus in. And at that time, we were 16 at the beginning, and the drinking age was 18. So we were able to, go to bars and drink underage at the time because, we looked close to 18 and, we had, a lot of fun back then. So, the guy that was running the spot, his name was Bruno. And for me, it was, eye opening to see what was going on there because it was a storefront, but all the windows were blacked out. And basically, there were young kids that were living there, and they would go out into Washington Square Park and hustle and find customers and bring them back to the spot. And so, that's ultimately how we first hooked up with Bruno. I think we were getting pounds anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 of really good green Mexi. The high upper mids. We used to call them pillows because when you broke them up, they were the light press, and they would fill up a gallon baggie, and all the way up. You'd have to stuff them up, and that would be like a pillow right there. So that used to be the pillows, and so I used to, buy those pounds and bring them back to New Jersey and sell them to my friends, break them down and stuff. But, when, I was buying weed from Bruno, he had moved like, so many times I can't even tell you because he went from, on Houston Street, he went from Mott Street around the corner. And there's probably the second time that we were on, well, I guess he had gotten hot on when he was on Houston Street because the second time I went there, I brought my cousin. And I remember it was cold. And so we went in there and we bought a pound. And so, and we didn't have no bag or nothing to put it in. And so it was winter. So my cousin had like this heavy, thick jacket, and so he kind of flattened it out and put it against his chest, and made it look like it was under. It was hard to tell that he had it underneath his jacket there. So when we left, the cops actually started following us down the street for some reason. We had crossed the street on Houston, and we were going I guess east or west, and the cops followed us. Like they just pulled up on us in a car, and they just kind of cruised really slow behind us as we walked the block. And my cousin was he was really scared, and so the cops just they just checked us out, and and then they just drove by, but they were definitely scoping on us, and so that was a kind of one of a scary moment right off the bat. But I would wind up following Bruno. I mean, I remember meeting him in a van. He was parked in a van on like might have been like Ninth or 10th Street, between Fifth and Sixth Avenue in the village, and he was just sitting in the van and just selling weed. And back then we had beepers, and so we had we'd beep them, and he used to walk around with that's when the first cell phones first came out, and he'd walk around with a suitcase and a telephone. And he graduated from going starting out down in the village, and then he moved up into Midtown. But when he was in Midtown, he was living in hotels. So he was in Henry Hudson. I remember going there quite a few times to buy weed. There were quite a few other different hotels that I don't quite remember the names, but he would jump from hotel to hotel, and sometimes he will let you up and you would be able to see everything, and then sometimes he would meet you on the corner, sometimes he'd meet you in your car, sometimes he'd send someone down. But it was always an adventure, because you would talk to the guy and he'd be like, yeah, go to this corner and wait there at 7 o'clock or whatever. And so then a lot of times you would be sitting there on the corner for an hour, 45 minutes. And one instance I remember just sitting there, and this woman was just walking around in circles on the corner, saying, she was holding a bag and she was saying, Dave, 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 Dave. And I just kind of knew that she was like kind of working for Bruno, and so I went up to her and I said, "Are you with Bruno?" And she's like, "Yeah." "Are you Dave?" I said, "No, I'm not Dave, but I'm the one that you're the person you're looking for." And so I handed her the money. She handed me the bag, and we both went on our way. And so, a lot of times, it was a nightmare, dealing with this guy. And so eventually, it just got so bad that there was a guy that was working for him, named Bobby J. And Bobby J, first, I guess, was just hang around. Then he started working security for Bruno. And then he first branched off on his own. But a lot of times Bruno would be like, "Go see this guy at this address." And so the very first time I met Bobby J, me and my neighbor, we used to both buy a pound each. So we were like, we would both be adamant about buying together, because we felt we had a little bit more buying power. And so Bruno was like, "Yeah, go over to this address." So we go to this address and knock on the door, and a guy answers, and we're like, "Yeah, Bruno sent us." And so he's like, "Well, only one of you guys can come in." And we're like, "No, no, we're not. We're both buying. We both got to check it out. We're both coming in. And so he's like, "All right, give me a minute." So, we're sitting in the hallway there, and then he lets us in, and it's just like this really small, cramped apartment, and we're kind of like in the kitchen area. And so, he, breaks out the weed, and him and my neighbor first start doing business, and he's looking at the weed and everything. And so I'm just standing in the corner, kind of just hanging around, and and then I noticed there was a hole in the wall, and and you could see, inside of, into the next room. And so, I take a peep in there, and I look in there, and there's some guy that's, kind of, he's like tied up to like a cross, and it was a dungeon. It was a dominatrix dungeon. And so the guy that we were buying weed from was I guess pimping someone, or he was the pimp. And he had someone, a girl that was working there. But little that we knew, that he was so scared that about us, that he had the girl in the bathroom with a gun ready to burst out if anything stupid happened. So I peep in there, and I see that, and I'm like, oh whoa, and so and then it's my turn. I buy my wheat, buy my pound, and so, the deal goes smooth. We're just like these Jersey boys, just want to come in, get our weed, just want to go. And so, so we're leaving, and, so my friend, we shake his hand and everything, and he's like, yeah, thanks a lot, buddy, and so, he goes to tap him on the back, and he tapped him on the lower back, and he had a gun strapped inside of his, of his belt there, so my friend felt it, and so, once we got down to the street and everything, my friend was like, yo, he had a gun on him. And I'm like, yeah, that was, I looked in there, and I seen some guy, he was tied up there. It looked like he was, it was a dungeon and stuff. And so, yeah, that was pretty wild experience. We were two Jersey boys, kind of green, never experienced stuff like that. But, after that, I had hooked up with Bobby J. And so, that I'm gonna leave that, for next week, when I hooked up with Bobby J. That was probably around 1987 that I started doing regular business with him. So pretty much I did business from Bruno from 85 to 87, which were, really crazy times during that time, because that's when, crack first hit the street, and it was just an epidemic that, no one ever saw. People, you wouldn't relate to it. It was just everywhere that you went. I remember the summer '86 was a drought that year, and there was more crack around than weed. And you would go into the parks, Washington Square Park, and there was just people openly smoking. The cops, they didn't know what was going on, and so, yeah, those were really, really crazy times. And so, yeah, so we'll cut it short. I don't want to leave these videos too long. I just want to, you know, take kind of short memory, so lapses, so I can remember, specific things. And I don't want to be too long-winded and keep these videos kind of short. But, I'm back on Instagram. I'm Top Dog Seed Strikes Again. Uh, I'm on X, and I'm on Facebook. Um, if you want seeds directly from me, you can email me at topdogseeds@protonmail.com. Till next time,